Okay, so I'm going to present some of the work that came out of my PhD. I'm not going to delve deeply into any empirical studies and bore you with loads of statistics and things like that. I rather want to talk about some kind of bigger picture things that came out of the research that left me with questions, more sort of holistic questions about, in this case, father absence. So I'm going to use father absence really as a kind of illustrative example to show you what I mean. So I'm going to explain how taking a behavioral ecology approach or an evolutionary ecology approach is useful when trying to understand human behavior. And I'm going to use this topic specifically. And then I suppose the point I'm going to try and make is that it's really important to bear in mind the contextual ecology or environment that people find themselves in and how they behave accordingly, which is essentially what behavioral ecology does. I'll get into that in more detail in a minute. As opposed to just giving you individual studies and going into them into detail. So hopefully this works if I do that. Right, so more specifically, here we go. I'm going to give a little bit of an outline, just a sort of theoretical framework, a bit about human evolutionary ecology, life history theory, and parental investment. These are all really big topics in anthropology. So I'm going to try and do them justice in a few slides, but just some of you might know what I'm talking about anyway, but for those who don't, I can then just go into a bit of detail and to explain how we use these approaches to answer these kind of questions. I'm going to talk then a bit about father absence, what it is, and then what we do and don't know from the literature from both weird and non-weird contexts. And this is really the crux of my talk. I would really want to try and get to the bottom of what this means and how things that we think we know about, say, father absence, really depends very much on the context that we're talking about.
You'd like me to spell out what weird means?
I will. And then I'm just going to give you some take-home points, really, and discussion points, hopefully. Right, so I'm going to start with a quick overview of a huge topic, human evolutionary ecology. So some people say human behavioral ecology, human evolutionary ecology. Behavioral ecology talks specifically about behavior. Evolutionary ecology talks about other things, including sort of age at maturity, body size, things that are not behavioral, that are also that will fall into a life history framework. So the ecology part basically refers to the environment that an organism finds itself in. This is a very well-known model used across biology, so it's not just for understanding human behavior or human traits. So basically little fishes or whatever will behave depending on the ecology that they find them in. So when I say ecology, I mean your environment, and that includes, importantly, your social environment as well for humans specifically. So life history theory is a part of human evolutionary ecology, and specifically deals with the timing of life events. So everything from birth to death, but particularly things like age and maturity. But it also includes clutch size, so number of babies, mortality rates, all sorts of things. I'll go into them in more detail in a minute. And then for humans as well, you get sort of associated behaviors that go with these things, like risk-taking behavior. I'll talk a little bit about more of that in detail. So here you have 4 different species, and the fish on the left-hand side, these guys. So what you have is that you have a sort of life history continuum from a fast to a slow strategy. And when I say strategy, I don't mean some conscious strategy. I'm talking about just the way creatures do what they do. So, for example, fish live relatively short lives. They lay lots of eggs. A lot of those eggs won't make it, or the little baby fishes won't make it. And so they basically take on a fast strategy. And then as you go along, I want to say the food chain, that's not really the right word to use. As animals get bigger and bigger, and they have fewer and fewer babies, and they live longer and longer. So these are the most important things, the sort of easiest ways to be able to assess where an animal lies on the continuum is body size, life expectancy, how long the animal is going to live for, and the numbers of babies they produce. The numbers of babies they produce also then leads to a section called parental investment. I'll find the arrows on this thing. Okay, so primate life history, These are some primates. And parental investment. So because we lie towards the slower end of the life history spectrum, we tend to have fewer children, but that also means that there's higher levels of parental investment. The fish don't invest that much in their young. Once the little ones hatch, off they go. But as you get further along, you get higher levels of parental investment. But there's also a lot of variation in primates. So these are little golden lion tamarins, really sweet, sort of New World monkeys, and they have a lot of paternal investment. So this is actually the father who's carrying the young. This is largely explained because they tend to twin. Almost all the time they have twins, so the females need help from the fathers. On the other side, you have orangutans. They have very, very slow life histories, probably the slowest among primates. Their young, although maybe humans notwithstanding, their young will stay with the mothers until they're about 10 years old, and they will, even when they are weaned at about age 8, they will still hang around and they need a bit of help. So they have very slow life courses. What makes us different, so we're not the biggest species. We don't have, completely the slowest life history, but what else sets us apart is that females have more than one offspring at a time. So women can have, say, 4, 5, 6 dependent children at once, which you won't find in these other species besides the twinning, but this is an exception. So human mothers need help because they can have more than one dependent child at the same time. So even once a child's weaned, they're by no means independent. And as I'm sure some of you know, that they'll be dependent for a long, long time, even longer than those guys. Okay, so the thing, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that humans and tamarins manage to co-opt investment also from the fathers of the child. There's a whole huge literature on cooperative breeding because mothers don't only get help from the fathers, they also get help from other people, but I'm not going to go into all of this now, but grandmothers and other family members and all this, I'm sure you've heard about this stuff before. Right, so that's your crash course in human evolutionary ecology, life history theory, parental investment. A lot of it's quite intuitive. I don't think it's terribly difficult to sort of to get into what I'm trying to say here. Great. So, what I've been talking about in terms of life history theory so far is really how we look at between species variation. So you can compare the fish to the rhino, and you think of them as separate species, right? So this is a taxonomic thing. With humans, we also find a lot of variation within the species. So this is something which makes us actually quite complicated to study. There's a lot of variation between groups of humans and even between individuals within those groups. Humans, as you know, inhabit across the world very different ecologies and economies. So you might think that, hunter-gatherer groups are going to have different life histories to, say, Londoners. But even more than that, even within a single group, or what we would consider a natural group, you can find a lot of variation between those individuals. And that's kind of what I want to get at today. So I'll give you an example. You guys may have seen this. It was quite a good paper that came out a few years ago, and it was in all the newspapers. James Cheshire at UCL, he plotted out life expectancies across a London tube map. It's all a bit depressing, really. But as you can see, there's actually 20 years of life expectancy variation just across London. So if you are lucky enough to live around Oxford Circus, you could hopefully live to about 96. But if you live down the East End, I think that Star Lane is just cut off on the end there, which is 75. Canning Town.
Was that in Shoreditch 34?
No.
84, is
Must
it?
be 84. Nobody knows. The life expectancy would not be 34.
That's where
June lives, so it's going to be dangerous.
But even within just a couple of miles across London, there is a huge amount of difference. And the moral of this story, and what this guy was trying to show, that unfortunately the biggest predictor of the differences in life expectancy in London is deprivation. Basically, if you're poor, you're going to die young. It's not good.
It's going down towards Brixton, where I live, isn't it, down there?
Yeah,
79, 78.
As you can see, so this is a rich country, this is an incredibly rich city, and life expectancy in general is not low. 34 is not realistic. Nevertheless, there is a lot of variation.
Has nothing to do with pollution? because Oxford Circus would be one of those places.
But if
Oxford
you can
Circus
afford a
has
flat in Oxford
the
Circus,
biggest life
pollution's not your
expectancy.
problem, is
Oxford
it?
Circus, you live to nearly 100.
You see the same thing
Correlation
outside
housing
London as
factor.
well.
Shush.
If you-
Yeah, you just have good food.
Why don't we let Paula say something?
Yeah.
Well, this is James Cheshire. You can look
Oh,
up
thank
this on
you.
the internet, and you'll see, you can read the Guardian articles about it, and they'll tell you all the things. I'm not sure what he did, if he did anything about pollution, but the bottom line is poverty, essentially, deprivation. So, with this example in mind, I'm going to get back to father absence, but I just wanted to show you that there is substantial variation even within rich countries in rich cities. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a bit of a brief background into what we know. This is a very well-researched topic across all the social sciences, psychologists, demographers, sociologists. A lot of people are interested in this topic. And if anyone is sort of interested in parental investment, a very obvious way to look at that is to see what happens when one parent is not there. Okay, so father absence became quite a hot topic. And there's a lot of evidence that shows at the moment that the impact of absent fathers has on children's education, emotional problems and depression, peer sociability, attachment, forming stable pair bonds themselves when they're older or not being able to, and then risk-taking behavior, early pubertal maturation, and age of reproduction. These bottom 2 points are really the ones I'm going to talk about in this talk. A lot of these come from other disciplines as well, but I'm interested in the life history outcomes of the kids. Okay, so age of maturity, so that's puberty, and actually starting to have babies. That's also what my PhD research focused on, so I feel better equipped to speak about that. I just want to make clear something here. It says evidence suggests a negative impact of absent fathers on child outcomes, especially with regard to these last two things. I'm not making value judgments. I'm trying to show what people do given a certain set of circumstances. So if your childhood ecology consists of, or doesn't have a father in it, or a single mother, or whatever it is, that's you end up doing what's best in that situation. And that's what I'm not making any value judgments. It may or may be good or bad for your education. That's not what I'm talking about. So just this word negative, don't take it that I'm passing any value. Right. So, what do we know? This is, like I said before, there's a lot of research that's already been done, and basically what most of the studies find out is that absent fathers are generally associated with accelerated progression to these events like puberty and age at first birth. So you could deduce then that kids without fathers are taking on a faster life history strategy, all right? And also the results tend to be very consistent. There's a lot of research, particularly looking at age of puberty. That was very common, but more and more now also looking at age at first birth. And then these other sort of associated behaviors as well. And it's almost always you will find this association. I will say, I should have said actually at the beginning, that all the studies that I'm referring to are from quantitative statistical analyses. So they are correlational studies, and the vast majority you can't actually really pull out any actual causation. You can't do experiments on humans without some ethical problems. So these are associations that we find. The other thing is there is a lot of qualitative work that's done, and I haven't done any qualitative work myself. I've read obviously quite a bit of it, and it's a whole not different topic, but it can open up a whole lot more than what I'm going to talk about here. I'm really just talking about associations, and I'll get to the interpretations later on. Right. So this thing about puberty and age of first birth and about having a life history strategy is essentially humans, like any other animals, take in resources, nutrition, and they spend some period of childhood growing, and then at a certain point, normally when they reach some kind of critical size, they can then divert resources into reproductive effort. So you stop growing, you stop becoming a child, you go through puberty, you mature, and you start having babies. So this is the different, and you've got to maintain your body as well, but you stop piling all of your resources into just growth. So the argument here is that father absence is actually sort of shortening the childhood to some extent. Okay. Another thing about these two particular findings is that a lot of the research has looked at outcomes looking at girls. There's a lot of reason for this, mainly because puberty for women is a very discrete marker. Usually this is proxied by age at first menstruation. There's good data to show that women are good at remembering when they first started menstruating, even many years after the case. And because it's a discrete time. So for boys, things like voice breaking, whatever, you're not likely to remember. It doesn't happen on a day, okay? So this is basically an issue of data. There's much more data on women. The other thing is that, and women are also more likely to remember their pregnancies and children. Not always the case for men, and sometimes men they might not even know that they're father children, right? So the data is not as accurate, one could say. Also, when you get big demographic surveys from across the world, it's usually the policy for the people doing the survey, to interview mothers. So they will use some sampling method and isolate households, and they will interview the woman of the house and ask her questions about the kids or the husband or whatever. So this is the way the data are collected. So it's not just that we're only interested in women, it's just that the data tend to make it easier to actually, well, there's just more of it for women. So a lot of what we know is about women. We don't know that much about men. Okay, so this is a sort of bunch of caveats I want to put in here. Again, with these correlational studies, there are other things that are going on. If we find an association between father absence and some or other outcome in children, there are lots of things. Fathers don't just disappear. Okay, there are likely to be things that lead up to that disappearance, so like divorce, and you need to try and isolate, is it the process of the parents divorcing and the stress presumably that would have caused in the household environment before the father became absent? Maybe that's what's having an effect on the kids, as opposed to the father being absent per se. Some studies do get at this. We've done some research actually where you can look at the difference between the divorce of the parents or the death of the parents, or a parent. So they're not insurmountable issues, but I just want to for you to bear in mind that there are these other things. And there are numerous other confounders. So with this in mind, I really want to get to the kind of main crux of what my talk is about, and that is, where's this evidence coming from? We know, okay, a lot of it's coming from women, but there's more than that, okay? So now we get to the weirdness that you want to talk about. So there's a great paper that came out in Nature in 2010 that's Joseph Henrich and colleagues wrote. Really super paper. Read it. It's short and it's punchy and it's really, really interesting, and it's freely available online. So WEIRD stands for wealthy, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And the crux of the paper was basically that most people are not this demographic. We think we are because we all, are quite self-centered, but most of the world just does not fit this. However, most of the data that we use comes from these people. So this is a quote from the paper. So the fact that the vast majority of the studies use WEIRD participants presents a challenge to the understanding of human psychology and behavior. A 2008 survey of the top psychology journals found that 96% of subjects were from Western industrialized countries, which house just 12% of the world's population. So there we are, the little WEIRD section, okay? Strange then that research articles routinely assume that their results are broadly representative, rarely adding even a cautionary footnote to how far their findings can be generalized to the rest of the world. Okay? So really... And this is a problem. I mean, this is why this was such a great paper. It really is, and they've written it very well. And it's not, in defense to it, a lot of this is driven by data problems. It's not easy to get the kind of data you need, particularly longitudinal data, which is great if you want to look at life history outcomes. We live for, 100 years or 80 years or whatever it is. This is a lot of data collection. So there just happens to be more of it in WEIRD settings. Nevertheless, there is data out there. There are data out there for these kinds of populations as well. The argument is, don't just assume because you read something about what people do that necessarily refers to what all people do. And this kind of goes back to what I'm talking about the behavioral ecology approach, is that people do behave given the circumstances that they're in. So not just the culture that they come from, but also their actual personal circumstances. another problem actually with the weird group is not just does all this 96% of the studies come from the weird population, but within that weird population, a large majority of them tend to be from psychology undergraduate students in America, which represents an even smaller, weirder niche of society, right? Who do they represent? A bunch of 19-year-old kids, and no. So again, just it's just a caution, I guess, of just really think about what you read and what it really means. So it is a problem, and it is a problem if we want to make inferences about humans. But as I said, I'm interested in, and this whole approach is interested in ecological variation in behavior. Okay? I think that's all I wanted to say there. Right, so what do we know now about the less weird populations? Oh, and another thing actually about less weird populations, if I go back to that slide, there's a lot of variation among this. It's not as if there's weird and non-weird, okay?
Yeah.
Weird and non-weird fall into many, many, many different types of ecologies. So that's another thing. So you're not expected to find these consistent results that you're expecting across. I mean, that would be very strange. Certainly looking at human behavior. Right. So as I just said, it's much clearer what we know from non-weird populations, the majority of the world. And in fact, because of all these different variations in the modes of production, in the types of people that they are, you might not expect to find the same thing. And now I'm talking specifically about this relationship between father absence and life history. Okay, and this is another thing, just a sort of in resource stress settings, which arguably is quite a lot of the world, you might expect that sort of social environments have different meanings to what they do in places where no one's really starving. Even here, where we do have poverty, no one is really, really, or very small majority are actually really nutritionally stressed to that extent. So, okay, I'm going to show you. I've got one stat slide, so I'm not going to. Hopefully, this won't be too horrible. This is a paper that I'm working on with Rebecca and David Cole, and it's a review paper looking at father absence and age at first birth only. So this is not puberty. So what these two little charts show is the number of studies. So the N numbers are here, are the actual numbers of studies that we've collated. And that's for weird population of girls and weird population of boys. The first bar shows the statistically significant findings. So that means that when people publish a paper, they go, we found a statistically significant relationship between father absence and age at first birth. It goes in there. Some papers say we found this relationship, but it wasn't significant, so you can't really then generalize to the population. Nevertheless, we also looked at these papers because we were interested in the direction of the effects. Is father absence associated with earlier or later timing of first birth? So the blue of the bars, excuse me, is for the number of studies where they found an accelerating effect, so younger ages at first birth. And then the orange is where there was actually, in some cases, delayed, but as you can see, only in the non-significant findings did we find that. Now, if we look at the non-weird...
is that the birth of weird girls and weird boys?
No, so this is women from a population, say, in the States or in Europe, and the relationship, their age at first birth...
Their age when they first give birth?
Yes. Right, okay. So I should make this more clear. So it's comparing children...
Okay.
The children's age when they start having children, okay, so adult children of people who, some of them grew up with fathers, some of them without, and then you compare those two groups. So this will be a girl who grew up with both parents, and what age did she first start having kids, and then compared to a girl who grew up with just one parent and what age she started having kids. Okay? Yeah, if there's any questions about the slide, I don't know if it's a bit statsy.
Sorry, what's SI? Sig and O?
Significant.
And O?
And
Number.
Oh.
N. N is the
What's
number
the
of
number?
studies.
N is the total.
Number of studies.
yeah, so
Yeah, but it's studies, not people, isn't it?
it's studies. So because this is a massive review, so
Yeah.
this is basically, we looked at all the literature to find, so we found 30 studies for girls. In 18 of them there were significant effects, and in all of those 18 significant effects there was always accelerated. So girls were having younger first births at a younger age, okay? And then for the non-weird population, so that's from the rest of the world, basically it's from low and middle income countries, you see much more mixed results. So basically all I want to show is that on that side you can see, look at the non-weird boys, and admittedly there are very few studies, okay? There just isn't the data, as I said. But you've got 3 studies, and 2 out of 3 of them, they actually found that not having a father delayed their starting to have kids.
Can you
Okay.
define what weird means? Is it an acronym? I'm getting the feel of what it is, but I still haven't figured it out.
Sorry, do you want me to go back to that?
I must have missed that.
It's just basically a sort of it's a shorthand for sort of what you would consider Western population, I guess.
Right.
So from rich
Industrialised
countries,
or-
yes,
Western educated industrial rich democracy.
yeah. So yeah, you can just think of it as high income and sort of low and middle income would be weird and non-weird if that's easier. Right, so anyway, we can see that there's just a lot more variation among the non-weird populations, whereas this is really consistent. If you just take these first 2 from the weird, you think, it's always the case, in all these studies, father absence always means earlier birth. Look at the rest of the world and you see, no, it's not so simple, okay? Right, so this brings us really to what is father absence? Why is there all this variation? I'm going to run through some theories and hypotheses because everyone who does this research, they like to come up with nice explanations for what's going on. Sorry,
I've got a few as well.
Do you use the term single parents, or is that out?
No, because I'm specifically talking about father absence. So you could have mother absence as well.
Yeah.
So it's not just any single parent. And also there can be step-parents and, all sorts of other things.
Also, you could have an absence without any emotional or legal implication as to the status between the parents as well, couldn't you?
Yes.
It could be an economic factor.
Well, some studies will look at mothers where the father was never around. So it's not as if the child lost the father at some point, the father was never there.
But also the father may, emigrate to send cash back home or something. It's not.
Yes, so again, in those sort of non-weird contexts, you get more of this kind of thing where you have like wage labour, migrant labour. So the fathers spend a lot of time away and they send money back. Exactly, so this is precisely what I'm trying to do, is try and think about what these different contexts, what do they mean? And what does father absence actually mean in those different contexts?
Are you taking war into consideration?
Some studies have looked at
Because
war.
that in itself has special impact.
Yes, I mean it's hard to then pull apart the father absence from this being in a war zone, but there are a couple of papers who've looked at that as a natural experiment. Right.
Sorry, somebody wanted to say something.
Oh.
Did any of them take into account same-sex couples?
No, not as far as I know. And maybe, I don't know, there might be more data available that becoming, more recently, but certainly not in non-weird contexts. I can't think of anyone who's collected that sort of information. Not that I know of, no. But that'd be kind of interesting to look at if parental investment, if it's about a father or just 2 parents. That would be cool to look at. Right, so James Chisholm argues that father absence is essentially a cue to a mortality rate. So remember earlier when I was looking at mortality and how this affects your life history strategy, what he's saying is that father absence is just any kind of stressful cue. So this would, in this case, refer to maternal and mother absence as well, or even just the divorce. So it manifests itself in psychosocial stress, and the children then have shorter childhoods, and they basically, if it is acute to mortality, then it makes reproductive and fitness sense to start reproducing younger. Okay.
Sorry, are we talking a weird here, or are we talking?
No, this is just
General theory.
This is just general theory. Although the context he would have been looking at more weird. Yes. So this is why you find this accelerated thing, because life is short. You better get on with it. I'm just going to. And also remember that the death of a father would have been more sort of common in ancestral times than say now. So he is really talking about an adaptive value.
What was his name again?
James Chisholm. Then Draper and Harpington and some others have taken it with them, have basically said that a very similar thing, but instead of mortality, that not having a father as a child is a cue to an unstable social environment. So basically, if you don't think that parents are investing, then chances are when you grow up, you're not going to find an investing mate, or you're not going to be one yourself if you're a son. So basically they say you may as well just, not wait for Mr. Right, so to speak. You may as well just get on with it as well. And both of these arguments had some criticism that they assume that the environment as a child predicts very well the environment as a grown-up, so that there's a stable environment, so that mortality rates wouldn't change, or that social environments and the investment behavior of fathers doesn't change over time. Right, so now we can look at some other arguments. Lowered investment. So this is a sort of direct thing that, especially nutritionally stressed environments, if the father's not around and he basically can't help contribute financially or nutritionally to the household, and this is probably going to, this is more of an argument in low-income situations, then maybe children are just not growing enough. So this is like a physiological response. Children will actually then, in this case, you would expect a delayed age at first birth, or puberty even, because children are just undernourished and they're taking longer to grow, and you need to reach a critical size in order to start heading down towards reproduction. And this may have been something that happened in the past. We can talk about that later. And then this says practical purposes. It's not a very nice way to put it, but I guess direct investment. And there's a few study here. Mark Flynn did a lot of work in the Caribbean, and he found that father-absent girls actually had earlier first births and marriages, bearing in mind a lot of these places marriage is the gateway to reproduction. And he, from his fieldwork, he sort of argued that it was a daughter guarding strategy. So having your father around, and this was only for girls, basically the fathers are kind of guarding the daughters to some extent, making sure that they, marry the right guy and holding them back and keeping them pure and all of this stuff. And this is, I suppose this kind of shows the advantage of being able to do this kind of field work where you can really get a better insight into what was going on in this particular culture in Dominica.
What happens if the father's beating everybody up and he's a pest and he's actually drinking and not bringing money home?
Right.
And luckily he drops dead. Well, that fit in?
Yeah. No, somebody actually asked me the other night. I said I was giving this talk and a friend said, is father absence always bad? No, of course.
No. It's a bloody relief.
It depends. Sometimes it's a good thing. And a lot of these kind of correlational studies, it's difficult to get at that. And like I said earlier, I'm not really talking about all the kind of details in the qualitative stuff, but of course there is going to be some proportion of kids who are better off without him, or without the mother for that matter. I mean, for sure there will be cases. All these statistical studies are basically taking averages. So on average, assuming that not all the kids are in these kind of abusive relationships or abusive families, on average do these kids have earlier or later first births?
But it's also projecting the values of the investigators onto the data, isn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, you find what you look for, basically, and as most of the investigators will be weird, then they'll be projecting their desire for weird outcomes, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people try and do research with bearing that kind of thing in mind, with integrity. I'm not saying everyone does, but I mean...
Are most of them men?
No. No.
If this is qualitative data, it's difficult. Quantitative, it's difficult then to impose values. If when
you
it's
get
qualitative,
consistent
then
trends,
you start to get these values. And
Sure.
if this is quantitative, then you can pretty much dismiss.
Yeah, you can find the
values.
correlation and it's there
exactly,
or not.
Exactly. So we can move on. Yeah.
So
Sorry.
Brooke Skelzer did another. She worked with Australian Aboriginals, the Martu, their hunter-gatherer group, and she found that she actually looked at male. She used the initiation rites as a proxy for puberty, or for and you can't get married unless you've been initiated as a boy in this group. And she found that those boys who didn't have their fathers actually had delayed initiation and therefore delayed marriage and kids and whatnot. And this is basically because the fathers they're sort of instrumental, they're supposed to help the boys physically to be initiated. If the father's not there, usually an uncle or another family member will step in and do that for the son, but he might have to wait until it's his cousin's initiation as well, and then, it'll become delayed. They're not going to do it specially. So that was her interpretation from a qualitative level when she found, from a qualitative point of view, when she found this correlation. But these guys were having later initiation processes.
That could be an advantage in some cases.
Yeah, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad for
Right,
you,
right.
you know. But from a fitness point of view, it might be better if you can get married, you know, if you don't wait too long. Okay, so and I think you guys have noticed that the first two things are much more in the sort of weird context, and where you expect accelerated, and then these are more likely to be applicable to, although not necessarily for the practical purpose, because you can think of lots of other things. But here, these are more likely to be in your sort of low-income context, and then you can argue for both delaying and accelerated age at first birth, depending on the group. So just to remind you, and this kind of just copy, this is exactly the same slide from before, just what I was going to say, you find all this consistency here in the weird settings, and then much less there, but the previous slide was just trying to explain why is it that we find all this variation, because of the different ecologies that people live in, and what father absence then means in these different settings. Okay, no more stats. Right.
Can I just have...
Yes.
Do you think you would find it easy to deliver this talk to a set of single parents?
It wouldn't matter, I suppose.
It's big because there's a lot of emotional stuff underlying those statistics. The statistics seem to be emotionless.
Yes.
Emotionless. Or something.
Well, we're just trying to look at correlations.
It's kind of dry, but if you had those people there that had lacked a father, or and to say this to them might actually be quite disturbing. Could be.
Maybe.
It depends on
It
how
would-
you
It could impact on.
That's why
it
we
may
banned
be,
them from the
but,
class,
But
right?
it may be emotionally quite.
I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people here who
Maybe
have
single
had,
parents.
an absent father or
Yeah.
something. I don't think it's.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm very involved with single parents and so on and so on. But yeah,
Why
I
don't we
think
leave
it's
all this
very.
to discussion after
Yeah,
the tea break?
we're going to have
Yeah, but
discussion.
I think it is a really important point.
The
actually.
objectification, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Can we
is that
listen
the
to
word?
the talk
Let's
first?
go with the
Yeah,
talk
can we have the talk first and then the
Yeah.
discussion?
okay,
But
well,
this
I'm
is
kind
an
of coming
actual
on to
break,
that
that's why I
anyway.
Yeah, let's go on.
Yeah, the talk's gone quicker than I thought it would. But anyway, this is basically what I wanted to come down to: is what does this mean, and talk about some discussion points, because the slide is not going to be it's going to be a disappointing slide because I'm going to put up questions, not answers. But this is exactly the kind of thing then that we can discuss. So, what conclusions can we actually draw about father absence from these different settings? Does father absence in itself mean something different? One argument could also be, in some instances, father absence is much more common than it is in other places. So is it, if father absence is a rare event, that it's having a stronger impact on kids than in places where father absence is quite common? Okay, clearly we can see that father absence means different things in different contexts. And like I said, non-weird and weird settings, you just have a lot of more variation anyway, so you don't expect to find this consistency. I wonder, maybe we can talk about this as well after the break. What can we say? Can we say anything about father absence or paternal investment, so fathering as opposed to father absence, in ancestral times? I started this research because I was originally interested in human pair bonding. And this was one way to try and be able to, have data. I only have data from the last 100 years or something, not obviously from ancestral times. But it was one way to try and look at this. But and at the end of it, I wasn't even sure how much we can really extrapolate to the past. Of course, I mean, this is something, Camilla, you've done some work on. It brings up a whole lot of other things, like what was the prevalence of pair bonding anyway? When did this sort of nuclear family idea come around? All of this stuff is open, but I don't know the answers, so we can talk about that. And obviously in nutritionally stressed environments, which presumably it would have been more of an issue in ancestral times, then, having paternal investment might have really been necessary.
Sorry, have you got a cut-off date for ancestral times? Is it just 100 years back?
No, I'm being deliberately very vague. I'm talking about Homo sapiens. In our species at least. But I mean, say 100,000 years ago, if you wanted a time, that would be interesting to know. So maybe not quite as far back as Homo erectus and whatever. So we're talking about people that don't look that different to us, but who live in different sort of ecologies. Another thing is, and this is kind of a big topic, are these responses, so we say that people given a certain situation, within a certain ecology, so whether they're hunter-gatherer or weird or whatever, given a certain social ecology, father absence or not, they react in a certain way, okay? So is this reaction then an adaptive response? Because the whole premise lying behind human behavioral ecology or evolutionary ecology is that humans are going to behave in some kind of an adaptive way, at least given the circumstances. So sometimes it's just making the best of a bad job. You can't always do what's ultimately, what would be the best scenario. So sometimes it is just a question of getting on and doing what you can. But I think this is kind of an interesting question to see if these are adaptive outcomes. And bearing in mind also that in weird settings, largely are very low fertility settings. So post-demographic transition, we live in, people are having very few children anymore. So, it looks like we're not behaving adaptively anyway. It looks like parents are investing much more in very few children, but sort of high-quality children, for want of a better word, where they invest a lot in education and housing and so on.
But that is an adaptation in
Well,
itself, because everything is adaptation rather than progression. This is a...
Yeah, okay. Well, it's just, it doesn't look adaptive from a fitness point of view when you could have 4 kids, but you're only having 1 or 2. However, there is some argument to say that investing so much in those children is to some extent adaptive. It's a big debate. The jury's out on that still.
But 2 or 3 generations down, it's unlikely that your grandkids will be having more children.
Exactly. So we just don't know how that's going to play out. If people are going to start having more kids again, based on all of this, time will tell. There's some quite interesting arguments for both sides.
Only if it's a decimation of the population.
What do you mean? Oh, you mean fertility rates are going down across the world.
Well, never mind, we'll talk about all this after, as soon as I'm going to get told off again.
I also want to point out, and this I think speaks to what you were saying a little bit, is that these are correlational studies. I'm looking at one part of a social environment, which happens to be father absence, as an example, and how this plays out in children's reproduction. By no means am I claiming that this is the only thing. I'm not trying to explain age at puberty or age at reproduction. Even if we can isolate actual causality between father absence and reproduction, there's almost no way it's possible that this is the only thing affecting that, right? Personalities, genetics, all sorts of other things come into it. It's not to say that, this is a deterministic thing. So that is another point I want to make.
Could be the neighbours.
Could be the neighbours, yeah. Right, so I hope it seems like there's going to be plenty to discuss. I just want to leave you with, these couple of things. It does mean different things, different contexts. But if you want to make any attempt at understanding behavioral human behaviour, it's really important to take the context into consideration. And a lot of, what you hear on the radio, read in the newspaper stuff, it's all like humans do this or people do this. Just basically take it all with a pinch of salt and think about who are the people that are these the 19-year-old psychology students or what, And like I said before, that, humans are expected to react in a way that makes sense in fitness terms, but sometimes that just means making the best of a bad job. And that's all. That's my supervisor, Rebecca Sear, and my lab group at LSHTM doing what we all do. We're all sitting in the garden eating cake. And drinking champagne. It was actually Kristen's engagement, so we were celebrating that.
So it's not male-dominated.
No, it's not.
Just put that...
We have 2 males now in our group, actually. Yeah.
No, let 2 of them in.
And that's all. If anyone, I don't know, this is a shameless plug, but if anyone wants to see any more of the research that I've done in more detail, all of these are open access and available freely to anyone. But good. That's all.